Good morning or good afternoon to all, since we have attendees from California to Europe for this webinar on a very current and very important topic. My name is Philippe Collard, and I am the General Manager of Rezoway USA, Rezoway's subsidiary in the US, and I'm going to make a shameless plug, and I promise it'll be the only one. Our mission is to facilitate the entry of European businesses in North America. This webinar is presented by Rezoway along with Detroit Regional Partnership and Lawrence Technological University, and I want to thank you both of these organizations for their support. It is an understatement to say that climate change is a major issue, if not the major issue of our time. We, as a global society, emit way too much GHGs. The question is, what can and what must we do about it in practical terms, as well as what are the impacts of carbon emission reductions on businesses around the world? That is precisely what we are going to discuss today, thanks to a panel of world experts whom I really want to thank for their contributions. You can ask questions in the chat line throughout the event, but we will provide answers during the Q&A session after all the presentations. Thank you so much. I will now hand it over to Will Butler, Vice President of Business Development at Detroit Regional Partnership, which is a co-sponsor of this event. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Philippe, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Very grateful to Rezoway, to Lawrence Tech University, and all of our partners on this webinar for the opportunity to speak with you all today. A little bit about me. My name is Will Butler. I'm Vice President of Business Development at the Detroit Regional Partnership. The DRP is a regional economic development agency for Southeast Michigan. We support companies as they locate and expand in the 11-county Detroit region that we represent. We provide complementary and confidential services, including customized data and research, incentive consultation, real estate identification, and staffing and recruiting support. As Philippe mentioned, there is perhaps no greater imperative for society right now than to decarbonize. And while that truth certainly presents challenges and obligations for businesses, as an economic developer, I firmly believe that it also presents opportunities for growth, both for individual firms as well as the economy as a whole. The clean tech sector is really at an inflection point. Technology readiness, price, consumer demand for sustainability have seemingly all met in perfect equilibrium. And with support from major federal U.S. programs like the Inflation Reduction Act and others through the Department of Energy, clean tech companies are bringing their products and solutions to market faster than ever before to more forcefully combat climate change. Here in Michigan and the Detroit region, we're working to do our part. Governor Gretchen Whitmer led the MI for Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, which is a commitment and pathway for the state to achieve 100% economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2050. The Centropolis Accelerator, who you're going to hear from later, in Southfield, Michigan, launched one of the nation's first dedicated clean tech hardware accelerators. Our major utility companies, consumers and DTE, both expect to have 40 to 50% of their generation from renewable energy sources by 2030 and have invested billions of dollars in new renewable energy capacity. DTE specifically has the number 1, number 2, and number 3 largest renewable energy deals in the country, as the company has reached agreements with GM, Ford, and Stellantis to power multiple facilities in the Detroit region from each automaker with renewable energy. Speaking of our automakers, our OEMs and suppliers are leading the transition towards electrification and more sustainable transportation. Michigan currently ranks number 1 in the U.S. for announced EV investment and number 3 in the U.S. for announced EV jobs. And since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, Michigan actually ranks 3rd in the nation for announced clean tech projects, with 18 projects generating over $9 billion in investment and over 10,000 new jobs. And for the Detroit Regional Partnership, we've been proud to support projects from clean energy companies like Nel Hydrogen, Bayotech, Luxwall, Bollinger Motors, and many others as they establish major facilities in Southeast Michigan. So while Michigan and the Detroit region are making and working to make great strides in the fight against climate change, we also recognize that we still have much to learn. So I'm pleased to hand the microphone back to Philippe to hear from our gathering of experts on the impacts, but also the opportunities for decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. We'll now hear from our first expert, Maxime, who will discuss climate change and low carbon, what's at stake for your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I hope that everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Thanks. So it was a great lead-in from Will on describing how lots of things come together in a kind of perfect storm right now to move lots of businesses towards the road of taking a different care of climate and also thinking low carbon as an opportunity. So I just want to start to kick off my discussion on this. I think climate and energy today are central topics for businesses in 2023. Anywhere that you can think about, these are two things that come on and on in all the economic news. Unfortunately, yeah, I think that everyone has picked in the news that that was from the New York Times that the floods in New York City have been extremely impactful just very recently. Every time that we do this kind of presentations, we realize that it's quite easy to find in any newspaper news about the fact that climate is changing and is impacting economic activity. There is no business today that can be run when the streets are flooding, where everything's dysfunctional, and when climate is putting so much of these events back and on again, back to our lives. So this is really very impactful. There's no business in such a climate. The second thing that I want to highlight is that oil price is going up. The gas has been going up pretty tremendously when I look back on the last 10 years. And yeah, the barrel of oil for October will reach $100 again. And I think what's interesting also when you follow this kind of news and economic news around oil price is that it's not about to change because the reserves are depleting and because there's more and more pressure, it's more and more difficult to find these precious resources. So all in all, climate, energy seem to be intertwined together and are very impacting for the business. And you know what? Low carbon is just about both. So that's why we'll cover both these aspects in this introduction. So just as a word of introduction, Rongi Solution is a consulting firm. We are senior chemical industry executives, had a history of 23 years in the industry, based in the French Alps with customers that range from Ohio to Poland today. So in Chinese, Rongi means simple. And it means that if you want to do things in a simple way, you have to embrace change. So that's what we are trying to basically walk our clients through, which is to think there is a wave coming and you need to surf it rather than to try to resist it. We are doing both sides of the climate equation, reduce the impact on climate, that's the low carbon part, and adapt to climate risks is the other side of it. So we are measuring, reducing, and making GHG assessment, life cycle analysis for different industries, typically large industries that are transforming matter into products. We are measuring and responding to climate risks. So we've developed a proprietary method for measuring these risks and walking through a value chain and identify where is it that climate can actually play adversely against the business in today, and also forecasting how it will move in the next 20 to 30 years. Driving the transition also takes knowledge and competencies, and you know, a webinar like this is an occasion to share a little bit some awareness on climate and how these things are impacting. I'm old enough to have been in university back in the 90s where there was no discussions about climate change. There was nothing in our curriculum that was basically helping us becoming engineers that would be able to navigate into this environment. So nowadays, managers need to go and embrace that also. So in 2022, we've measured about 500,000 tons, just on 2022 alone, 500,000 tons of CO2. We've identified reductions of 35% in what we've measured, and 2/3 of the solutions are actually profitable and actually bring value to the business. When you're reducing energy consumption, you're typically saving money, which is great for the business. Yeah, I said that we have clients in lots of parts of the world, mostly in the chemical industry, and these are just a few of the ones that we've been serving. So we'll start with the start. Climate change fundamentals. What is happening? What is greenhouse effect? Everybody is talking about GHGs and greenhouse. Sometimes we have to go back to the fundamentals. Without GHG, Earth would be just slightly warmer than Venus, not a very habitable place. Infrared radiation would be emitted by Earth, and our average temperature will be minus 18 degrees for people who don't, minus 18 degrees C. So whether you're talking Celsius or Fahrenheit, that's a very cool place. Because we have this atmosphere around us, the greenhouse gas is trapping this heat and make sure that some of this heat is actually kept, which is making the atmosphere warmer and hence allows life on Earth. So without greenhouse gases, there will be no life on Earth. But as very often, too much of one thing is probably too much and can impact our lives. And that's what we are seeing with the issues with the greenhouse gases. There is an accumulation of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The first one that everyone thinks about is CO2, because that's what we talk about. You know, there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and that's the reference. That's how we measure actually what is present in our atmosphere. But it's not the only greenhouse gas. Methane is another very potent one, and methane typically comes from agriculture. Farming, cattle are emitting methane, and oil and gas has also in transportation lots of leaks that can contribute to this. Agriculture typically releases also N2O, which is coming from fertilizers, and this has an extremely impactful effect on greenhouse gas. 265 kilos means that it's 265 more potent than CO2. So for instance, when we're assessing industries and they have releases of N2O for one reason or the other, we have to be very careful. Most industries that we work with have also lots of other very, very powerful greenhouse gases, typically in the installations. The cold systems and the semiconductor or cleaning systems will use PFCs and HFCs that have an extreme potential. So a leak of 100 kilos or 200 pounds or something like that, 220 pounds in the atmosphere will actually be extremely impactful compared to the CO2. One of the issues also with lots of these gases except CH4 is that they have a long residence time in the atmosphere. So when they're up for a long time and they are contributing to climate change. Now, everybody says, well, it's true that the GHGs have increased, but how has it been? In the last million year or so, last million years, actually, when you go back, you realize that the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has been naturally balanced between 175 and 300 ppm. So 175 and 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. There have been ups and downs. Every time that there's been an up, actually, it's correlated with higher global temperature. So the people who are having a look back and are having a look at the quantity of ice, for instance, on the ice caps when they are doing drillings and when they are analyzing what was present in the atmosphere at the time, realize that any of the spike in CO2 has led to higher global temperature. Before the industrial era, so back in the 70s, 50s, we reckon that there was about 280 ppm. So you see that's where this little curve was ending, and it was kind of plateauing. We don't know what could have happened if we had not intervened and had not done that. So the current concentration in the atmosphere is 417. So this is not an Excel artifact that will show my limitations in pasting graphs into PowerPoints. This is really what is happening. We are way, way above the previous times, and we are also getting there in a way which is extremely accelerated compared to any of the other evaluations that you can see. If you were a chemical engineer running a process, you know that the process is badly not under control. And you can hear also sometimes that we have reached this kind of levels in the past. It's true, but not in the last 3 million years. And at the time, the temperature was warmer by 3 to 4 degrees. And there were trees in Antarctica, and the sea levels were 15 to 20 meters higher because there were no ice caps anywhere. So yeah, we are doing something which is pretty impactful right now. And where is the CO2 coming from? So sometimes we talk about temperature and how much the climate has warmed since 1850. I think we have to realize that back to the last ice age, I think lots of the people today on the call would have seen, if they were living in North America, a very different environment than the one that they are used to. So the ice caps were going pretty low into the continent, and that's where they were in the last ice age, so 20,000 years ago, before the CO2 started to increase again. Today, this is a picture of today because we don't have good satellite pictures of 1850s. There's been some rebuild from what it looked like at the last ice age, but apparently the 1850 is missing. But that's probably something comparable to that. The difference between these two are 5 degrees C or 9 Fahrenheit. So when we're talking about what has happened in the last couple of years, which is 1 degree, we have already closed like 1/4 of what took us from the last ice age to today. So when you're seeing the temperatures outside, and 2023 is probably the warmest year on record in the last couple of million years, this has only changed slightly. And it starts to put this in perspective that 1 or 2 degrees C, so 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of change is a huge difference. It can make a huge difference. So how do we know where is it coming from? It's anthropogenic. This is a new word that has been invented to say that it's something that that mankind has done to an environment. These are the temperatures observed on the surface of Earth. I mentioned 1.1 degrees C before, 2 Fahrenheit or something. That's the change that we have observed. And the scientists from the IPCCs have been putting this in perspective and try to rationalize all this. And they simulated and try to understand what would have happened with natural causes when they simulate the extra that is coming from human plus the natural causes. That's where they can rebuild what we have been observing in terms of temperatures change. And it's clear that it's the GHG into the atmosphere that has actually been increasing the temperatures at the surface of Earth. So where do GHGs come from? I think that you got a hint now that fossil fuels being burnt are releasing carbon that has been sunk for a very long time. And natural gas, oil, and coal are the 3 main culprits. And why are we doing this? We are mostly doing this for energy. Agriculture and forestry and land use has also a big impact. We've been talking about fertilizers, for instance, contributing to GHG. We've been talking about deforestation, which is associated sometimes with lots of production of the livestock. By the way, it's not because the livestock is produced down the road that it is not causing deforestation, because lots of the cattle food, for instance, comes from sources that are associated with deforestation. So there's always a long global road to some of that stuff. So it's clear that fossil fuels have enabled a tremendous, very fast economic growth, but has led to a release of GHG that has caused the climate change. The consequences, I won't, to me, beat a dead horse right now. Canada, you've all seen the mega fires that were totally out of control this year. This is a consequence of dryness and increased temperature. We've seen oceans, they are getting higher. There are major heat waves, marine heat waves that are causing issues with biodiversity. The sea currents are being changed. In Europe, we have lots and lots of different effects, including the Mediterranean hurricane. Everybody has seen what happened with Libya, for instance, which is not something that we had witnessed before. So we have a warmer Mediterranean, which is powering superstorms that we have not seen before, and it affects businesses directly. 80% of the chemicals in Europe actually go to the Rhine at some point of their history, and the Rhine today is at a very low level. And the succession of drought and the succession of low levels of the Rhine River is really impacting the businesses relatively directly. South Asia, you've seen the heat waves between 45 and 50 C that has made some parts of Pakistan and India being classified as not habitable anymore. New Zealand has seen rains and floods very recently. Africa has been an intense drought, 6 years without rain. So we have to remember that, the same cause, which is climate change, can actually cause drought or storms. South America is living the same. In the US, you've seen lots of temperature records in the last couple of months. And globally, there are more mosquito-borne disease. And there's actually a proliferation of mosquitoes that are actually coming from climate change. We are seeing in Europe, for instance, an increase into tropical diseases that we've never seen in the past. So all of this is becoming more frequent and more intense, and it will get worse with additional warming. That's why the difference between 1.5 to 2 degrees C is very important, and that's something that people seem to really focus on right now. We say that it will be very hard to maintain 1.5, but the difference between 1.5 and 2 is a big difference in terms of the intensity of the heat waves, for instance, or their frequency. Saying that heat waves that were happening before every 10 years happen basically 6 years out of 10 is a very different ballgame. And there is no prosperity in a +4 degrees world. I mean, we have no really model that says that actually we can find enough food and enough living habitat in the world to let us survive in this 4 degrees C. So it's very important to do something about it. So if you didn't have time, GHG emissions cause climate change, and climate change causes climate risks. When you talk about climate action, low carbon and adapt to risks are kind of coming together and influencing these two effects. So low carbon transition in businesses, what does it mean? Well, this on the left is the history or the trajectories, the different scenarios that the IPCC has put together in terms of emissions. And I've said that emissions are linked to temperature. So if we think that we continue to emit a lot of GHGs, there will be lots of physical risks. It will be a very warm world. So with direct exposures to lots of these climate effects that I talked about, this has an impact on businesses. If you can't work outside because either there's a big thunderstorms or there is drought again, or it's too warm, it has an impact on the business. If we're on the low end, if we manage to reduce really very, very aggressively the emissions, there will be transition risks associated to that. And transition risks are typically change in regulations, societal choices, consumption, energy prices. Well, it will be very hard. It's also very, very hard and putting a lot of pressure on businesses. And in the end, regardless of whether we think that we manage to reduce emissions or not, the depletion of natural resources is a problem. And that's one that I probably want to put a bit of emphasis on right now. Oil and gas it's a depletion business, right? It's a fossil fuel. It's available somewhere. It's been put somewhere in the ground million years ago. And today we consume about 100 million barrels per day, which turns into 37 billion barrels per year. The barrel has been Mr. Drake's what Mr. Drake's found to put the oil in Pennsylvania the first time. And when we have a look at how much we discover every year, you see it's this is a graph this collected from lots of different sources. All of them are public, by the way, so you can go and check the history of discoveries. And we can see that there is a landing. We are gradually finding less and less oil. And it's kind of logic that it's true for all natural resources. The more you try to find them, the harder they are to find, and the less you can actually take out of the ground. Today we consume this. So you can see this gap, right? The discoveries today represent 1/7 of the consumption, of the annual consumption. Oil companies used to report every year the rate of replacement of reserves, basically how much they put back into the bank compared to what they had taken out. They are not doing this in the last 10 to 20 years because this is becoming a smaller and smaller number compared to actually how much they exploit and how much they produce. So there's a problem here. We are moving from an era of abundance where we're finding more oil than we could find, than we could consume, to a period of scarcity. So in the end, it's a kind of lead into why would people try to go low carbon? Why would you want to go So why do you want to go low carbon? Some people say it's because of ESG. So we find people who are committed to economic, social, environmental issues and want to do something about that and say low carbon is kind of natural, you know. Some others are thinking resilience. They say, well, you know what? I think that climate is putting a lot of risks and is raising the bar in terms of exposure of my businesses to this weather inclements. So I need to prepare. There's an idea also of being more of autonomy, of being more self-sufficient in terms of energy, for instance. So there's an idea of resilience. Cost and competitiveness is very important too. The more you consume GHG, and they are very, very volatile. We talked about oil price before. Having a business which runs at $20 a barrel or a business that runs at $20 or $100 per barrel is a very different kind of perspective in terms of costs, regardless of what you're doing, whether you are driving trucks, whether you are using natural resources, all of that is linked to oil. Oil is still like 85%, oil and gas is 85% of the energy that we consume today. So in a world where this is diminishing, where the reserve is diminishing, the prices will be more volatile and on the rise. What we see though is that most of the clients that come to us, they are coming because they are pushed by people. And they are pushed by three kinds of people, three kinds of stakeholders. And we are moving towards something closer to a stakeholder economy where investors, customers, and employees are very important. And we could do a little quiz right now to ask ourselves, why do people come most? we see that there's a lot of upward pressure from customers. I'll give you an example. Procter & Gamble is interesting because it's a B2C business. It's a good proxy to understand business engagement. And they have this very great plan about environmental climate. They talk about climate, and a lot of it is reduced GHG. So they want to go into these low carbon directions. And by the way, you can you can have a look at the report online. They also say, well, we will reduce supply chain emissions and we work with our suppliers to do that. So it means that when the P&G decides to do something because they feel that their customers need to do something, because the investors ask them to do something about the climate and low carbon, it's very powerful, and it's also forcing the suppliers to go and participate into that. So environmental commitments are serving a broad communication purpose internally, in the value chain, and also in the investors community. So businesses are committing more and more to low carbon. You see that's the number of companies who basically say to science-based target, which is an NGO organization which is linked to the United Nations, who basically checks that, who basically is registering commitments from businesses. As SBTi has registered more and more companies, and more say they want to get their targets approved. And for a business to be approved means that you go and talk to them and say that you want to be compliant with the Paris Agreement and stay within 1.5 degrees ultimately. Disclosures are also on the rise. Basically, people ask businesses, they are basically asking businesses to go and declare to CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, how much they are emitting. Today, it's covering 16% of the global emissions, so it's no small beer. This is becoming mainstream. So I said something about investors. Insurance companies also are very, very keen in understanding what you will do with low carbon and how do you view climate, because they are seeing the cost being on the rise. These are just for United States only, the $1 billion of disaster events that are coming and caused by weather events. And in a climate that is becoming warmer and more, which is changing, this is clearly rising. To the point where you can see, and I've just quote here in XDI, something quite interesting about the fact that the future looks uninsurable. It's not the first time that we see, like State Farm announced that it will not be offering new policies in California to in part of rapidly growing catastrophe exposure. Same thing in Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon. So there are lots of places where insuring your home because you are in a place that can be subject to floods or in a place that can be subject to drought or storms is becoming an increasing fact. I mentioned before that energy is behind everything what we are doing, and it's behind all GHGs also. So we'll talk a little bit about energy return on energy invested, so that you understand that actually we try to, because we're running out of conventional oil that comes cheaply out of the ground. We started to do hydraulic fracturing, for instance, where we inject water into the ground to extract shale gas and tight oil. We've been doing deep offshore, like this is, I think, this is probably in Guyana, where they are drilling at 10,000 feet under the sea level. And oil sands in Canada, where you have very, very thick oil, which is mixed with sand that we need to go and dissolve in a solvent if you want to take it out. So I think you can visualize why this is becoming more and more complicated. The EROI, so the energy that you take out of the one that you invest and the amount of work that you have to put in to get some of this energy back is increasing tremendously. And this is the main reason why it's putting pressure. It's putting a tremendous pressure on the cost of oil. We used to, in the US, drill at 100 to 1. So basically with 1 barrel of oil that you needed to power the pump, you would extract $100 barrels. We're now down to 5 to 1 when you think hydraulic fracturing. And this has a direct impact on costs. There's also a big exposure to geopolitical risks. I talked about the fact that, and the best way to measure the risk is something that everyone in the business understands is in dollars. The lower the energy return on energy invested is decreasing, so there are more costs. Supply demand, there's tension because we find less oil, but geopolitics is also playing a role, and I think everyone witnessed that, especially in gas at the time of the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And the countries sitting on the largest oil reserves are not all countries that are easy to deal with from a geopolitical standpoint. And I think that's a big understatement that everyone will understand when you have a look at the list of countries. By the way, the US is not on this list because the US has a much smaller reserve than any of these countries. So the annual average price of oil has done only one thing. It's gone up, and it's not likely to change for the reasons I mentioned. Now, low carbon transition is affordable. The IPCC says that we can cut emissions by 50% by 2030 at less than $100 per ton. And there's a whole report that talks about that. I will just give you the fine prints, the executive summary. Renewable energies, fuel switching, reduce methane emissions, preserve the carbon sinks, changing agriculture practices, increase share of plants in diets, energy and material efficiency in all sectors, and demand management, which is basically reducing the amount of energy that we need to sobriety. Knowledge, funding, and willingness are essential. Transition is good business. Cost of renewables have dropped and continue to drop, and it's making them competitive now. The problem, for instance, is not anymore the costs to make more wind turbines. That's permitting. And you can see that. And I want to put in front of this these curves, the curve again of the cost of the price of an oil barrel. You have one that is rising on one end and one which is just at the beginning of becoming cheaper and cheaper. Now there's an environment that leads us to be low carbon. ESG commitment has been once something that was more voluntary, and you can think about all this SBTI, Together for Sustainability, RSPO. There are lots of making LEED buildings, for instance. No one is forcing you to qualify your building as a LEED, as the US Green Building Council has developed this ranking for buildings. But there are more and more mandatory pressure. Some are climate focused and some are multi-focused. So 56 countries have direct climate laws that are covering 53% of global emissions. So it's clear that there's a move from being only climate focused and going to multi-focused and moving more and more towards the idea that it's actually part of a mandate and businesses have to do it. So there are a couple of international standards that you might have heard about. TCFD, for instance, giving a framework and also for the financial community to be protected, basically, and to support risk pricing. And it's been embraced by several countries, including in the US. The SEC is proliferating the idea that TCFD will be mandatory. ISSB is also, it's right now voluntary, but it's also providing very good insights into lots of what you could explore in terms of climate risks and low carbon. Europe has been leading the pace, I would say, on that, with the mandatory reporting that is starting in 2025 based on 2024 data, which will lead companies operating in Europe to do two things: double materiality, understand their impact on the business, their impact on the environment, which is measuring GHG and providing low carbon solutions, and also assess the impact of climate on the business. There are many ways to finance this transition, and I know that we'll talk about this a bit later, but the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's been mentioned before, targeting GHG abatement of 40% in the US with 370 billion put on the table is a reasonable amount to go and get started into some of these thoughts. It's actually only second because Europe has put more money on the table. 550 billion euros right now, are still more than $370 billion to reach 55% reduction by 2035. There's a suite of tools that they are putting in place with forced reduction of emissions, energy markets, power purchase agreements, renewable energy certificates, thinking about carbon tax and carbon border adjustment mechanism. All of this is creating a conducive environment to go low carbon. So as key takeaways, and I think I've reached my time, why would you do that? One, it's expected by stakeholders. Climate threats rise at an unprecedented speed. I mean, try to build this picture for you that we are in a very, very steep increase, and you see that we are getting warmer and warmer. That's what these stripes are about. It's getting warmer and warmer at an accelerated speed. It's unavoidable. There are tensions on oil and gas that will put pressure on your business. Regardless of the business that you're in, you are consuming oil and gas in significant amounts somewhere on your value chain. So it's unavoidable. You've got to do something. It is possible. So that's the good news. There's an opportunity. There are available tools and technologies, and more are being worked throughout innovation to go and add more to the tool set. So it's possible. It's not, we're not talking about things that are totally out of reach and can be achieved with things that we could reasonably expect today. And I would say, as a conclusion, as business owners, it's desirable for resilience and profitability. You will drive your costs down. You will be less dependent of a vanishing resource, and it is supported by finance and expected by regulators. So all of that is creating the right time and the right environment in 2023 to move to low carbon.
Thank you, Maxime. Thank you, Maxime. Now I will hand it over to Josh and Phil Swanson from Centropolis Accelerator. And they will discuss decarbonization projects and innovation challenges. Thank you.
Awesome. Josh, we're all set?
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for having us. My name is Philippe Swanson. I work with Centropolis Accelerator. This is Josh. I can never pronounce your last name.
Hey everybody, I'm Josh Bergman. I'm also an expert in residence at the Centropolis Accelerator.
Yep, my background is 10 years in industry before moving into early stage venture. Worked with Whirlpool Corporation in advanced development, advanced manufacturing, and I had the opportunity to launch not only low carbon efforts in the plant, but also some actual consumer products. But if you could go to the next slide, I can kind of talk about what we do at Centropolis with our C3 accelerator. So Centropolis is a hard tech, deep tech accelerator focused on two work streams or two value streams, one being the climate and the other being Industry 4.0. So it's our mission to help anybody developing hardware products and designing and manufacturing those products in Michigan accelerate through the different valleys of depth from a hardware perspective. And then also helping existing manufacturers adopt new clean carbon-free technologies as well as best-in-class Industry 4.0 technologies. Again, you can see our mantra at the bottom, but it's really enabling those who have physical ideas and products to bring them to life. We also have a $6 million zero equity essentially acceleration fund, in the form of zero interest loans over the course of 24 months. You can imagine that's kind of a royalty fee-based fund. And hopefully we'll be having some additional equity tools for startups here that we can invest and help scale clean tech, climate tech, and other circular economy technologies.
One of the programs that we run through Lawrence Tech University and the Centropolis Accelerator is called Restart. And so what Restart does is it uses retired professionals, and it allows us to go out and conduct energy and waste reduction assessments for small and medium-sized businesses across the state of Michigan, and also for public entities. So, when we think about the decarbonization process, this is really the critical first step, one of many, and we'll talk about a lot of other steps to take, but this is a great program that organizations in Michigan can take advantage of.
Yep, and some other programs that organizations and companies can take advantage of is an Industry 4.0 implementation grant. This not only is for Industry 4.0, but also can be for efficiency and process improvement projects and other potentially climate-oriented and carbon-oriented projects. You can see there's some stipulations here in terms of the size of the company, what they can, how large they can be, but there's the opportunity to get some funding and matching funding from the state. So this is something if you guys are interested in, don't hesitate to reach out. More importantly, though, we are currently running what we're going in the Industrial Decarbonization Innovation Challenge. So earlier this year, we were in talks with Eagle about some industrial decarbonization efforts. And we essentially pitched them on the idea of if we can run this global decarbonization challenge for some corporate sponsors, we can use our expertise as a clean tech accelerator and an Industry 4.0 accelerator to source best-in-class technologies from early-stage companies to scale-ups to established firms to help support our corporate partners in reducing their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Next slide. So you can see who our partners are for this challenge. We have state and federal organizations like EGLE, the MBDC, and NREL supporting us. And then our private sector sponsors include Whirlpool Corporation, Gerdau, Breakthrough Energy, and then obviously ourselves at Centropolis Accelerator. So why industrial decarbonization? So outside of being a massive source of CO2 emissions on the industrial side, you'll see a number of organizations making very public commitments to reducing the scope of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and potentially hitting net zero production. However, everyone is really exhausted kind of the low-hanging fruit in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions, and no one is really tackling scope 3 in a very structured way yet. And even if you look at the state level, the state of Michigan, we've made some commitments to hit a net zero economy by 2050. And so we're going to need a lot of help in terms of technologies to execute against those plans. You go to the next slide. Everyone here kind of really knows what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. But when we were talking with our corporate partners, we really were starting to focus, okay, what are the things that you guys are having issues with? A lot of them have control of their manufacturing facilities. A lot of them have done the LED bulb replacements, a lot of HVAC efficiency, potentially getting some green electrons into the building, but they really need help as soon as they get outside of that direct control. What are the indirect sources that we can still start helping them with? And then what are the upstream and downstream sources of CO2 emissions when you get into the distribution, logistics, tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers? As soon as it's out of line of sight, how can we really help? So that was really our focus. Next slide. And you can kind of skip this one. I think everybody's very understand what the net zero DOE roadmap is, but again, this was a big input. And so I talked about that Michigan Eagle executive directive a little bit earlier. I alluded to it, but this is coming from our the governor's office saying, okay, we need to hit a net zero economy. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, 52% by 2030, with that huge goal in 2050 to have an economy-wide carbon neutral economy by 2050. Next slide. And so the big 3 focus areas after talking with our corporate partners, the state, and some other organizations that are supporting us, we came up with decarbonizing how we manufacture things. And we'll go into detail with all of these later. And decarbonizing the built environment and decarbonizing the supply chain. So we dive deep into that first focus area. The next slide. And decarbonizing how we manufacture things. Really just say, okay, we need to use clean energy to produce and change our production processes, but also you get down to the machine level applications, right? We know we can move on. So how do we actually bring more CO2 or carbon neutral materials into the actual manufacturing and fabrication of the things that we build? So you can see some very specific use cases here: decarbonizing water heating technologies, breakthroughs in hydrogen fuel for electric boilers, substitutes for natural gas equipment, and methods to retrofit and electrify natural gas. I was joking after talking with a number of different corporates as we were talking about this. We could just have this be the electrified natural gas challenge, because everyone is really looking for different solutions to get that out of their production processes. And you go to the next slide. And so decarbonizing the built environment, like I mentioned, not only is this the easy solutions in terms of, okay, we better insulate walls, we can potentially use maybe some green materials in the manufacturing of these buildings, but we really want to understand and monitor the buildings we occupy and decarbonize those environments through new technologies to make the buildings more efficient, build buildings that are more efficient, and emit zero carbon during that manufacturing. So obviously low cost energy consumption metering, dynamic supply chains across multiple energy sources. So this is one that's come up a lot, is how do you manage grid, wind, solar, and store in batteries so that you can have essentially best cost, best impact in terms of your energy mix. And that leads into that dynamic load balancing. And when we get into the decarbonizing the supply chain, we want to leverage circular design processes, materials, and manufacturing technologies to really eliminate carbon from that supply chain coming in and out of each of these industrial processes. So not only with the goods that are coming in that we're transforming into new products, but as we move those new products out into the world, how can we do that in the most efficient way possible? So you can see material and product recycling technologies as a focus. We reuse parts returned back from products that we've had out in the field or that consumers have used and get those back into the manufacturing for remanufacturing. And what new materials exist, for manufacturing processes that are carbon neutral or carbon negative. All right, next slide. So the benefits for companies that decide to apply to the challenge. The main challenge benefit here is you get access to our corporate partners and potentially run commercial pilots, with up to $250K each for these paid pilots. The corporate partners we're working with, they're very experienced with running these pilots at the manufacturing facilities, and I've worked with a number of them before. So those different paid pilot programs, depending on the scope, can be as small as 50K. It can be as large as $1 million. We're really, kind of putting a little bit of a cap there because we want to focus the efforts of the companies we bring in. The companies get to meet one-on-one with the decision makers after we down select them in our review process so that they can accelerate to that pilot phase. Obviously, then there's access to expert and mentors through Centropolis, but also our partners at NREL and Breakthrough Energy. And you get to connect with industry experts and other commercial partners potentially. And then also you get access to our tools and development expertise so that they can potentially accelerate the work that they're already doing and potentially get into new markets and help them get access to new capital as they look to raise and grow and build their companies. Next slide. So the challenge process, we've opened up the challenge for applications. We did that in August. We're accepting applications all the way through the end of November, November 30th. We'll review those applications in earnest during December. We're already doing some small internal down selecting right now. But after that review, we'll have one-on-one meetings with each of the corporate partners with those down selected organizations. We'll announce those finalists in February, and then we'll have more celebratory pitch event in March and April that gives those finalists the opportunity to pitch in front of a group of venture capitalists, CVCs, corporate venture capital arms, and other nonprofit organizations to help them potentially further the development of their technology outside of the pilot projects.
Cool. So thanks, Phil. So Phil and I are both experts in residence at Centropolis, and Centropolis is an awesome organization. It does a lot of really impactful work in the state of Michigan. I'm also co-founder of Fresh Coast Climate Solutions. We're a climate consulting company based here in Michigan, and wanted to share with you some of what we're also seeing in the decarbonization space. And so Fresh Coast also works hand in hand with Centropolis Accelerator to help them operate some of the programs that they do in addition to some of our other work. So our team is absolutely passionate about helping to reverse climate change. We get up every day to try to bring some really bold and impactful solutions to the table. We are past the point of wanting to do small pilot projects. We are past the point of doing anything insignificant and want to really be bold and transformative. There's three main areas that we're working in. One is climate and carbon, and the others are biodiversity and water. And so we bring all this together into the solutions that we bring to the table. This was kind of mentioned before, but when we think about the decarbonization space, Maxime mentioned all the drivers that are going on out there, and I can't stress enough the drivers that the private sector has right now. So you're seeing right now all the Fortune 500 companies on the right, a lot of companies that have either net zero or carbon neutral or 100% renewable electricity commitments. And the important point that I want to make here is, the private sector is driving a lot of these. Some of them are also being driven by regulation and financial stakeholders, but every single one of these companies has a supply chain. And so the commitments, the carbon commitments, the decarbonization commitments are now starting to filter down through the supply chains. And that is where, quite frankly, a lot of the help is needed. Organizations are really realizing that not only they might need to do it from a regulatory standpoint, but it is making business sense. And you can slice and dice this and look at this whatever way you want, but they're seeing that investors are demanding it. They are understanding that this is absolutely critical for risk reduction in their own business. There's plenty of evidence out there now that having these types of climate programs in place helps with top line growth or cost reduction. And employees want to work for organizations that are doing good. So it's helping with both talent attraction and retention. And so all this is coming together. I think all of us on the webinar right now can say that we're at a pretty critical tipping point right now where there's just a lot of activity in the market. And so when we think about emissions, I just want to really make this point for everyone. If you're an organization, and what Phil had that image up of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so imagine you're Procter & Gamble, like we saw before, and you have let's say a net zero commitment. The only way for you to get to that net zero commitment is by also focusing on scope 3. Okay, so up on the screen on the right, you're seeing some major sectors across the globe, and you're seeing on the chart scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And hopefully you have a pretty quick visual takeaway that most of the emission profile for these industries, and thus the companies, is all embedded in scope 3. So you can do all you want all day long with your scope 1 and 2. You're never going to get to your target. And so you have to engage on scope 3. Now that's really scary. This is a tough nut to crack. However, one of the things that I really like to say is that your scope 3 is usually someone else's scope 1 and 2. And so it's really forcing you to be able to work with your supply chain. And that's part of what we're seeing happen in the market right now. Everyone has a different journey that they need to go on. They might have a different starting place. Every organization has a different starting point and a level of maturity in terms of what they're doing. But overall, the journey is that there are some constants here. And so organizations need to start out thinking about how they can measure what they're already doing. You can't change what you can't measure. And then figuring out what they're going to do. And the implementation part for me then is the most exciting. This is where the action happens. Quite frankly, if we're going to move the needle on climate change, we need to do it in the implementation part. There are a lot of options on the table here, and this is what we spend a lot of time with organizations at Fresh Coast doing. And then lastly, tracking and reporting. So this is an iterative process. Companies will continuously go through this, but this is absolutely critical on your path to decarbonization. Now, the implementation part, I think it's important to think about what you can do along your path to decarbonization, whether you're thinking about scope 1, 2, or 3. And so again, it's starting with baselining what your inventory looks like or your climate impacts and coming up with your action plan or your strategy. That basic starting point is getting some of your energy efficiency improvements in place, but pretty quickly we need to move past that. If we want to move the needle on climate change, we got to get to thinking about things like electrifying our buildings and our fleets. And we know that if we want to get to net zero, we're going to have to electrify. And then you get to the point where you can start to think about renewables. Are you putting renewables on your own facility? Are you doing power purchase agreements? Or are you sourcing them from your utility company? Very early on, the Detroit Regional Partnership said we have some of the biggest deals happening right now between DTE and some of our major automotive manufacturers. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. They're shifting their source of electricity over to renewables. And then you need to start thinking about, all right, how do I tackle scope 3? How do I start working with my supply chain? Am I engaging in things like improving biodiversity, protecting watersheds, wetlands, other types of carbon sinks that are going to be absolutely critical to getting to scope 3 emissions? So there's a lot of strategies and tactics there. They usually most likely get outside of the traditional 4 walls that a lot of organizations think about from their operations or their manufacturing operations. So there are a couple programs that we operate that I thought would be helpful to highlight. We do this in conjunction with Centropolis. So this is a Centropolis program. It's called the Michigan Climate Wise Business Program. And what we're seeing, just to emphasize again, is you have these larger companies with climate commitments. It's starting to filter down through the supply chain. And so when we start to talk to a smaller supplier that is maybe 25 or 50 employees, maybe 250 employees, usually they don't have the technical know-how to know what to do, and they don't have the bandwidth. Someone at the organization, when I'm on the phone with them, is usually saying, hey, what do I do? Where do I start? This is something, I already have a day job. This is my night job now. And so we created the Michigan Climate Wise program to help out with that, to help keep our manufacturers, our small manufacturers in Michigan competitive, so they can help their clients, their customers meet their climate commitments. So think of someone like General Motors, who has a climate commitment. They have a small supplier partner. That supplier is now going to be able to help General Motors keep their climate commitment and feed the data to them. So the Michigan Climate Wise program helps these companies establish greenhouse gas emission baselines and come up with strategies. It helps do things like life cycle assessments and climate impact assessments of the widgets they make, so they can use that data to be able to talk to their customers and talk to the investors. It does things like electrification planning, also water and biodiversity strategies. And we can also do ESG programs. So just a quick insight into how we're engaging with some of these small manufacturers who they don't know where to start. They don't know what to do. It's usually, hey, I need to do this CD report, or I'm having the customer ask me for this. And so we kind of pull back from that and help them get an overall strategy in place. So for instance, when we're working with someone on an ESG strategy, we have an initial call with them. We go over all the different ESG framework areas, discuss those with them, and then we conduct a materiality survey where both the business and all their stakeholders have input. That then gets us to number 3, where there's an output, a materiality matrix, which helps rank what their highest priorities will be. Often decarbonization or associated efforts are up there, and then develops their priority areas and an implementation plan. And so this process gives that organization who doesn't know where to start or what to do a roadmap on how to move forward and where they should be spending their time, effort, and money to advance the climate needle. So that's just one example. A couple other examples that I wanted to mention, to tie in with what Phil said about decarbonizing the widgets that we make. We do work with Just Climate. Just Climate is a $1 billion climate fund based out of London. And what we help them with is their due diligence on the front end before they do a deal. So one of the investments that I can talk about that's now been made public is the recent investment in H2 Green Steel. So that completely transforms steel manufacturing to be decarbonized. And there's a lot of information out there on the website, but it's climate investors like this that are really starting to make I can't stress enough, a very transformative difference on how we are doing business. And so I'm starting to see this type of work infiltrate the investment space. We are also doing work for other investors in the same tune, and helping entrepreneurs that have in startup businesses get their data in place ahead of time so they can have a better conversation with the investors and essentially de-risk them up front, and the investors are more likely to invest in them. The last thing I want to mention is decarbonizing the supply chain. We did some recent work with the Center for Automotive Research here, where we interviewed a variety of different automotive manufacturers and their suppliers, looking at ESG commitments, which obviously includes decarbonization, and how we can help bridge the gap between a lot of the efforts and the communication that's going on to have a more cohesive decarbonization effort out there. This is absolutely critical. And so again, what we're seeing here is you've got these big corporate commitments, but when it gets down to the boots on the ground supply chain level, especially at your tier 2 or tier 3, there's a lot of need for technical assistance and extra bandwidth to help these suppliers out. And so this has been a really important program. One last thing I want to mention, there are a plethora of supply chain regulations that are either in place or are coming into place soon. This is everything from worker welfare to green product claims to ESG data to scope 1, 2, and 3 data. And I can't stress enough how much of a game changer this is. When we talk to, let's say, a company based here in Michigan that's doing business in Europe, they're using a lot of the European regulations as their baseline and how they're doing business now. And this stuff affects the entire supply chain. So just know that these are out there. A lot of them are coming. Would be more than happy to talk to you more about these, but it's really transforming supply chains and transforming the level of detail at which the companies now understand their supply chains. So leave it at that. Really appreciate your time and being able to share with you what Phil and I are doing with Centropolis and Fresh Coast Climate Solutions to help decarbonize our industry out there.
Well, thank you so much. It was very interesting. And now I will hand it off to Juliette, who's going to talk to us about low carbon toolsets. So Juliette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. So we've, Josh and Maxime told us about the background, why is the climate changing and why it's become an imperative to businesses. We'll talk now a little bit more about how can they pilot that, as Josh was explaining. So you've heard the term a couple of times, why net zero? So we'll start there. Basically because CO2 has that warming potential on the climate, and because it stays in the atmosphere once it's there, limiting warming basically means a maximum budget of cumulative CO2 emission. So when we say we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees per the Paris Agreement, we need to reduce emissions. And when we simulate emissions trajectories that get us there, you can see that on the graph here. Basically, there's different trajectory, but all of them mean a peak of emissions this decade, and reaching that net zero, the point where there's no the balance between what we send to the atmosphere and what we take out is at zero. So the blue area is basically trajectories of emission that limit warming to 1.5. The gray is also getting there by end of the century, but it means that at some point during the century would exceed that 1.5 degree. And if we delay action on reducing emissions, it means that at some point in the second part of the century, we need negative emissions to compensate and bring the temperature back from its overshoot. So basically, net zero is that point on around 2050 when we need zero emissions if we want to limit warming as per the Paris Agreement. So that's a global goal, and basically the question is how can we achieve that? So if you look at what's pouring into the atmosphere right now, 2019, 59 gigaton of GHG emissions went into the atmosphere. Some of it was captured back by land and especially the ocean. But all in all, right now, there's about 60% that stays in the atmosphere, and that's driving this increase in concentration. So if we want to achieve net zero, we basically need to reduce the left part and to some extent increase the sinks on the right-hand side. And we first need to reduce emissions because the capacity to increase the sinks is relatively limited. So if we want to reach that balance, we really have to act on the left-hand side and reduce emissions. Paris Agreement basically means reducing emissions by 80%. That's what the trajectory that you saw on the previous charts mean. So how can businesses contribute? It's sometimes helpful to structure, that thinking, and framework are emerging to do that. There's basically three pillars of how businesses can contribute to that global net zero goal. The first two pillars will focus on the left-hand side, reducing emissions. So first, businesses can reduce their own emissions through first measuring and then implementing reduction program. And that's what we'll get into in a bit more detail. Once they've done that, the other way is that they can contribute to reducing the GHG emissions of others. That's basically offering products and services that contribute to others' emissions dropping. They can also finance projects that would contribute to reducing emissions elsewhere outside of their value chain. Those two pillars focus on the left-hand side, and then what obviously businesses can do as well is contribute to the carbon sinks. And that can be either in their own operations, but also through financing of projects that contribute to the health of global carbon sinks. In any case, because the foundation is we need to reduce emissions, the first prerequisite will be to measure greenhouse gases emissions, and that's what we will first talk about. So we'll talk about what's called GHG accounting, how that's done. It's also called sometimes carbon accounting because carbon in CO2 is the biggest greenhouse gas. So you've seen that chart before, which is basically depicting where emissions come from when you look at an activity. The concept behind doing the GHG inventory of an organization is to look at all the flows that are necessary for the company's activity. Because GHG will come from any point in the value chain. We sometimes talk a lot about direct emission. This is really what you would measure out of the stack if you were to put a cover with a stack on top of a business. This will be emissions coming from combustion of fossil fuel, but also emissions like can happen in the cement or steel industry. But that's not the only point. There will be energy consumption upstream as well as downstream. The goal is to measure broad and include indirect emissions, because what you're really trying to get at is both what is the activity's impact on climate, but also what is the dependence on fossil fuels of the entire value chain. Because as Maxime showed before, GHG and energy are more or less two sides of the same coin. And so by having that GHG inventory encompass the whole value chain, you measure total impact on climate and total dependence on fossil fuels. We'll move on to the basics of a GHG inventory. So the goal will be to list all the flows and activities and then calculate what their impact is in terms of GHG. The way that is done is you will start with activity data, which will be things like how much energy consumption was required, how far did product move, what was the money spent on different services. And then to convert this activity data into GHG emissions, you use what's called emission factor. So this is basically something that will tell you how many kilos of emissions are associated with 1 kilo of material or per kilometer, mile driven, per dollar spent, depending on the activity sector. A GHG inventory accounts for all GHG emissions, so not only CO2, but you'll also have those emission factors that give you how much methane was emitted through the value chain. For instance, if you consume natural gas somewhere upstream, there was some leak of methane, and that will impact climate. All of these GHG are reported in what is called CO2 equivalent, basically bringing their potency back to what equivalent of CO2 would have been emitted to have the same impact. So basically, if there's 1 ton of methane emitted, it's 30 tons of CO2 equivalent, because methane is 30 times more potent on a 100-year horizon. So as you can see, it's not a direct measurement, and there's always a GHG inventory is always communicated with an uncertainty that reflects both the accuracy of the emission factor, but also of the activity data. The goal of a GHG inventory is to be informative, to support sound decision making by all stakeholders. So whether it be the company itself, its customers, the financing community, and so forth. Accordingly, there's 5 key principles that underpin GHG accounting. The first one is relevance. And so Basically, because the GHG inventory is meant to support some business decision, the boundary needs to be to reflect the essence of the business. So it's not just a matter of what do I own, but also what do I need to operate, and we tie that back to the Scope 3 discussion. Whenever you set your boundary, it needs to be complete. So everything that is within the boundaries that you define to draw your inventory, to do your inventory, needs to be in. Your GHG inventory, you will also do it over time to track your performance, make sure you're heading in the right direction and meeting your targets. And so it needs to be consistent. You don't do it 1 year with a certain boundary and the next year with a different one. Your calculation factors, the method you use will need to be consistent. It needs to be transparent around the methodology that you choose, the assumptions you make, the sources, and all of that needs to be documented, justify, and disclose, again, so that people can make up their mind about what you show. And then obviously it needs to be accurate. I did say that an inventory is always communicated with uncertainty, but over time you should work to reduce those uncertainty. You also need to make sure that you're neither over or underestimated your GHG consistently. Again, for that GHG inventory to be a good basis for decision making. So how do you move from activity data to GHG emissions? So you will list all the activities that are needed for your business, whether it's the energy consumption, purchases, freight, whatever emissions will be linked to the disposition of your product, whatever your spend is. And then you multiply it by those emission factors. So emission factor can be different. Some of them, but it's rare, will be direct measurements. So for instance, if you're a chemical company, you can have a stack with a metering out of the stack on how much N2O emissions you have, for instance. Most often, though, it's those factors that I was talking about, which come from either life cycle analysis databases, or they can also be supplier-specific data. So for instance, somebody who has done their GHG inventory and has broken it down at the product level. So here you can see what that would like for energy, and you can see that gas for per kilowatt hour has much less GHG emission than fuel and coal, for instance. But you can also see how different material from steel, aluminum, glass, and plastic compare in terms of kilo of emission that have been emitted to make them available at the door of whoever will transform them. But it can also be by object. A car is about 8 tons of CO2 equivalent, a smartphone about 40 kilos. And then the last type of emission factors that you'll find is monetary ratio. This is an easy one because basically you look at what is the GHG emission of a sector and you divide it by its revenue and you get those emissions per dollar spent. As much as possible in GHG accounting, the physical approach should be favored over financial spend, so overusing those monetary ratio. Couple of reasons for that. The first one is that they are closer to reality. They much more reflect the nature of what you're buying. The other reason is that if you use monetary ratio, the only thing you can do to reduce GHG is spend less. And if spending less was synonym to lower environmental impact, I think we would all be glad, but we would all also be very surprised. So really as much as possible, and especially for the flow that will represent the bigger portion of an inventory, the physical approach should be favored because it gives you much more levers to reduce. The boundary of inventory, so we talked about how you need to define the perimeter, what you will encompass in your inventory. That choice is absolutely essential to whatever results you will get. And so the principle that we just discussed, they should really guide how you draw those boundaries. There will be a couple of key aspects to consider. The first one is organizational. If you're just one company, that might be easier, but if you have stakes in other companies, you will need to decide whether you use an equity share approach where you own 20% of a company. Do you take 20% of their GHG inventory? Or do you take a control approach where you say, I will only count in my perimeter what I control. So for instance, where I have majority oversight, or everything that I operate, even if I don't have full equity. So that's from an organizational standpoint, and that needs to be defined upfront. The other boundary consideration is operational, and it ties back to that diagram with scope that we looked at before. You will need to define which scopes or activities are in and which are out. As Josh was saying, scope 3 is very often significant, both in terms of emissions, and he showed that, but remember, emissions and climate risk exposure is two sides of the same coin. So it's also where most of your risks lie. Including scope 3 is also an opportunity for effective reduction. Typically, we have, as a company, influence over that what happens upstream and downstream, and it opened the door for collaboration in a life cycle perspective. So it also avoids, impact transfer. And then, interestingly, scope 3, that importance of scope 3 is increasingly recognized and mandated. And more, although some frameworks don't prescribe scope 3 reporting, companies that do not engage on scope 3 are perceived as either lacking knowledge and understanding or just purely greenwashing. To illustrate that impact of perimeter, I'll just share a quick example. So TotalEnergies, a big French company, oil and gas company, reported its emission at 400 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Greenpeace is saying it's 4 times more. Now, it's not just a matter of it being Greenpeace versus TotalEnergies. It's really a question of boundary and what was included. Trading and indirect emissions are included in the Greenpeace view of things, and it's not in the TotalEnergies view of things. So this is really to stress the importance of when you hear numbers, and when it's really important to go back to what is the boundary considered. Different frameworks and standards exist. ISO standard and the GHG protocol are the best known internationally, and you can see how similar they are, because basically the GHG protocol, which is the oldest framework, has inspired the ISO standard. Talking about categories in ISO versus scope in GHG protocol, but you can see how the mapping is pretty similar. Other frameworks exist. Overall, they're usually consistent. They do cover all GHG emissions, so not just CO2, but also methane and the other greenhouse gases. In all cases, biogenic carbon, so CO2 coming from biosourced materials and energy, is accounted separately. Another point where they're consistent is that avoided emissions and offsets are not included in the company's inventory. They can be reported along with the inventory, but they're kept separate. One difference between the GHG protocol and some of the other standards is what is called market-based reporting, and so we'll drill into that a little bit more. So that dual reporting is a specificity in the GHG protocol, and it's for electricity only, so scope 2. The concept is when you do a location base, you reflect the physical reality of the electricity you're getting. So basically, you multiply your consumption by the emission factor of the grid you're connected to, or whichever local supply you're plugged into. So for instance, if you directly consume energy from a solar farm or from your own panels, that will be very low GHG. But if you're plugged to the grid, you will use a grid emission factor. The market-based approach is a different view. It's reflecting contractual instruments. So it's moving away from the physical reality of the electrons you're getting, but saying, well, I'm actually buying through different instruments a certain type of electricity, whether it be through power purchase agreement, renewable energy certificate, or being plugged to a specific supplier, specific grid. The dual reporting is mandated under GHG protocol. So basically, if there's a market, like it exists in many countries where there's a green electricity market, then you need to report both under location and market-based views. That means that a residual mix emission factor needs to be available. So basically, if some people are buying the green electrons, then it leaves only the brown electrons for who is not using those instruments. And for whichever electricity consumption that you have, if you're not buying green electricity, then you need to use that residual mix. It's important to note that that market-based approach was at some point extended to other products than electricity, but that has been removed. And right now, the GHG protocol is revisiting it's the whole market-based approach for electricity, but also for other aspects where it might be including, based on the questioning of whether the market-based approach has really led to actual emissions reduction, or if it's some of the investment would have happened anyway. So this is something that is a very important and a hot topic, because a lot of companies have been using the market-based approach in their target setting. So more to come on that. The consultation and discussions are ongoing. We talked about supply chain engagement. So one of the things that is important is also the product or service carbon footprint. And so basically what happened is once you have your overall organization footprint, you may be asked by your customer, what is the footprint of what I'm buying for you? So this will basically be a subset of the organization's footprint, and standards and guidances are developing to explain how to do that calculation, that breaking down at the product or service level. It's important to know that in some geographies or sectors, it's actually something that's becoming mandated. So you can do that two ways. On one hand, you could look at your inventory and say, look, I have my total inventory, my total revenue, my total production, and I can calculate the intensity of whatever I'm selling. So in that example, product A and product B at the same footprint. Ideally, you'd like to go down to something a bit more specific, and I just put an example here, an illustration. If you're making product A and product B, but 2/3 of the inputs are needed for product A, then that would give you different numbers for product A and product B. So that's really what's the essence of getting down to the product or service carbon footprint. There's a lot of claims that are happening on net zero and product being carbon neutral. Often, a lot of that includes offsets, but can also be reflecting some incorporation of biogenic credits. Because of a lot of focus on avoiding greenwashing and sometimes that making it into laws, a lot of work is going on around, how should you do those product or service carbon footprint? And more guidances are being put out there to frame and prescribe how this should be done. And this is important because ultimately, as the focus on climate moves through the value chain, the carbon footprint of product and services will be part of the purchasing decisions of the companies that are trying to get to net zero. Between one service that is 20% more carbon intensive and one that is less, then that will be part of the decision making. So once you have your footprint, you will start trying to reduce emissions, because that's really what you're trying to do, from inventory to mitigation. So you map your flow, quantify your flows, calculate your emissions as we've seen, and then you'll analyze the results so that you can determine what levers you have. Once you've done that, rinse and repeat, you move into the usual continuous improvement loop, or plan, do, act, check, and repeat. Reducing your own emissions is really leveraging concept that exists already in terms of safety or quality management, the SOAR process of continuous improvement. It's typically helpful to think of those reduction actions in 3 buckets. Sufficiency, which is questioning the need of a process step or packaging. Efficiency, which is once you've defined that you need to do that thing, then how are you going to do it as efficiently? There you will find everything around insulation, optimized payload, waste reduction, circularity. And then once you've done those 2 levers, then typically comes substitution, where you try and find low carbon ways of doing the thing you need to do that you've tried to do as efficiently as you can. And that's where you find electrification of processes, alternative fuels and materials, and so forth. Once you've identified all those levers that you have, it's typically helpful to quantify that And that's what it gives you. So basically, each of the bar on the chart on the left is an idea. The width of the bar represents its decarbonization potential, so how much CO2 equivalent it can abate. And the height of the bar is whether it's a cost or a financial benefit to the company. This is helpful because you can then quickly visualize what is the profile of production that you have. Do you have a lot of things that are costly or not costly? How do they compare to what can be what is existing in your value chain and so forth? It can help define your strategy and objective, because from that you can then translate how am I going to bring my GHG down to something that's compatible with Paris Agreement. And remember, that's about an 80% reduction by 2050. So you'll start putting those bricks next to each other to bring you down that level. That trajectory is what can be tested against the Paris Agreement, and that's what an organization like the Science Based Targets organization do, is they actually look at plans that companies put together, not just they look at their commitment and see, okay, is that compatible? Is it reaching that overall minus 80% by 2050 with interim targets as well. So once you've done that, you've really acted on the pillar A of what we looked at before. You've reduced your own emissions. But you can also further contribute by working on pillar B and C. And I'll give you some examples. So pillar B would be reducing the GHG emissions of others through products and services. For instance, if you're selling EVs, you may be displacing thermal engine, and so you're reducing emissions of people that are in your value chain, but you're not going to see that in your inventory. You could also finance projects, so for instance, funding solar programs in developing countries for them to use instead of fossil energy. You could also contribute to the second half of our net zero equation through carbon sink. You could, for instance, if you have land, you could reforest, but you could also drive changes in your value chain. For instance, if you're an agro-industrial business, you could drive changes in the agricultural practices of your value chain. You could also fund reforestation projects. And a lot of that is what we see today in the offset markets. The frameworks on, what does net zero mean for businesses are being formalized. The two main known as SBTi, again, has developed a net zero framework that looks really like this one, which is a net zero initiative. And they have a lot of similarity because it is helpful to think about the contribution to net zero along those three lines of reducing own emissions, reducing others' emission, and then helping the carbon sinks. Ultimately, it's a transformation journey that companies are embarking on, where it's and if you look at it through two dimensions, there's a question of where are you heading and how good are you at doing it. Today, there's quite a bit of vision and low effectiveness, and the risk here is really greenwashing. There's also a lot of businesses that are starting to move, but are starting from the bottom left corner. To do that, like many things, you will need to engage your people and grow awareness around those ideas. So getting, we didn't learn climate in university, and so getting that awareness is important at all levels of the organization. People are what make it happen. Developing competencies along the same line. It's not just important to understand the importance, but you need to have the competency to manage this internally. And like any other journey that companies have been on quality, safety, governance, and management system are critical, including KPIs and internal and external communication with stakeholders. In summary, the road to net zero for businesses is really becoming, part of the business. The climate action is an imperative, and it needs to be grounded in numbers. So first measure, and then we enter a very well-known process of planning, do, check, and act, which is familiar. There's really tricky key pillars, and they need to be done in order. It's first minimize your own emissions, including your value chain, and then you can think about how you contribute further to reducing emissions of others and carbon sinks restoration. And people are key to success, which means education and awareness, but also governance strategies and KPI, because ultimately carbon needs to, need to be part of the culture of the business. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Byrne, who's in California. And he's going to talk to us about decarbonization of transportation. So
thank you, Philippe, and thank you, everyone, all the previous presenters. I've learned a lot, and I'm also looking forward to threading in the transportation aspect a little bit here. There's a couple of sort of base pieces that I'd like to add before I really sort of jump into the content, and that is that even though transportation is only between 11 and 15% of emissions worldwide, there are a lot of areas, locations around the world where it's a majority of their emissions. So rural areas, it can be the majority of emissions. And also, likewise, when it comes to power sources, if you are going to try and decarbonize it or electrify it, you run into the situation where it's going to be pulling a lot of power in places that may or may not be ready for it. So I think because of that, it has to some extent a bit of a disproportionate impact in terms of putting the pieces together in the puzzle of climate. And that's, I think, part of why I've been so excited about it. So I'm going to linger here a little bit because it's sort of, as I mentioned, putting all these pieces together is the struggle. And particularly when you're talking about something like transportation, where there are so many moving parts and they're all needing to interact with one another, you get a situation where it all has to very much work in harmony. So whereas perhaps if you have one manufacturing facility, you can get your power through either on-site or power purchase agreement, and you can kind of work it in the direction of wherever you're at to wherever you're going in a somewhat linear fashion. With transportation, because you have fleets that are distributed, because you have vehicles that are traveling all over the world, and also at the moment, because of the incredibly rapid pace of technological innovation, including supply chain changes, it becomes definitely a moving target. And as a result of that, there's a lot of aspects that are needed to be kept in mind simultaneously. I've worked with a number of fleet managers for whom this felt daunting or overwhelming. And I think part of the reason for that is this is an industry and an area that has been basically running, business as usual for quite a long time. And as a result of that, this is a major disruption to business as usual. It's a major disruption to how we perceive value. And so I'll try to get into what some of that looks like. A little side note too is that even though at the very beginning of, say, the automobile revolution with the early automobile brands, even though there were electric vehicles, they had always succumbed to the challenge of range. So even though there were a fleet of electric taxis operating in New York City, in the very early days of automobile use, they couldn't go out into the country. And so in terms of them displacing the previous technology, which was horses, it was somewhat limited until the internal combustion motor came around. So you could say the same thing for other areas. So for example, shipping or trains or what have you. But as you can see on the left, there are a number of different options coming to market now, and also the possibility, because of something that we'll talk about, which is essentially technology, both cost curves and learning curves, sort of one and the same, but also a little bit different, which we'll get into, which basically makes the potential for change and major disruption greater and greater as time goes on. And that's also linked to the change in cost curves and learning curves for power generation like solar and wind, geothermal, which theoretically could bring all of that needed power. So we will get into each of these separately, but just briefly, you can see that United Airlines, what's called an eVTOL, which is a sort of like a vertical takeoff and landing electric vehicle. There are a number of companies doing that right now. So that's one form of e-mobility. In the second one, there are ships that are now already in use that are fully electric or are using some other kind of zero emission, most notably in Europe. Trains, obviously, Europe, Asia, electrified and have been electrified for a very long time. The rumblings of some of that starting to happen in parts of the United States. And then the most breakaway is that's an image of the Tesla Semi. And the Tesla Semi has just been completing its real world testing just this last few months out in the real world here in California, and has been performing very well and is able to do sort of not just short runs, but also medium runs, and even with the potential of longer runs. And then, of course, you have a huge revolution that's happened in Asia, where all of the motor scooters are slowly becoming electrified. It just makes more sense from a cost perspective, and also it's highly regulated. So cost and regulation are definitely going to be themes of this talk. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, so total cost of ownership is probably one of the most important aspects right now of decarbonization and particularly electrification for transportation. Total cost of ownership reflects what does it cost to run that vehicle for its full life cycle. So assuming like a fleet vehicle lasts maybe 10 years, maybe 5 for very heavy use fleets, a personal vehicle, as we'll see, can last upwards of 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 years for a lot of EV drivetrains. So basically the question is, what you're paying for, what does that give you? And the reality is that when you mix all the technologies with also the learning curves of some of those technologies, with also some of the incentives and also the cost of energy, whether it be comparison between liquid fuels and electric sources, you start to see that the total cost of ownership for a lot of these decarbonized transportation options is much lower. So, if you look at it for 10 years or 15 years, it's a much cheaper vehicle to own and run. And that also gives rise to new business models, something that we'll get into as well. So when you're looking at the aspects of maintenance, fuel, depreciation, at the moment, EVs have a worse, lesser depreciation, or they depreciate more than traditional, but that has to do with batteries, and batteries are changing very fast, so that could even be improved. Insurance, I know there's a lot being written about Teslas and how insurable they are, and they tend to get much lower insurance rates if you're working it right. Incentives, we'll talk about, that's basically the area I've been working in mostly. Infrastructure is at the moment the most convoluted area, partly because what I mentioned before, where it's difficult to get that much power to a site. But a good example of this would be a 90% reduction in OPEX, operating expense, for a ZEV ship, but 3 times the CapEx. So you need all this upfront money to save yourself a tremendous amount of money, and and theoretically that can be very useful. So if we can go to the next slide. Regulation. So this is the space I've been working in. Regulation is massive here in California for decarbonization of transportation. I won't go through all of this, but essentially you can get a sense that certain pieces of transportation are highly regulated. In California, you could even say hyper-regulated, and that, in my eyes, is a good thing. I think that sends a really clear signal, and I think that's the point of the regulators, to send a very clear signal not only to fleets but also to manufacturers. So there's something called advanced clean trucks, which required trucks, certain proportion of OEM truck models to be zero emission by certain times. That's been adopted by 8 states so far, with the likelihood of it expanding. You have a very strict drayage regulation here in California, which means that by 2035 they will all be zero emission, which is, as you can imagine, pretty quick for something that is typically using very old trucks. They have very small margins. E-True regulations has to do with both the refrigerants and also the fuel source, so they have to be electrified. And then there just recently, the EU passed a sustainable aviation fuel requirement, so 75% by 2050. We can go to the next slide. All right, so this is my favorite area. The technology is so fast. It is moving so fast. It's insane. You know, if I had given this presentation 3 months ago, a lot of what I'd be saying would not have been useful today. And 3 months before that, and 3 months before that. It's quarterly, very, very fast moving. So obviously, it's been a very exciting space to work in. According to Elon Musk, there's a certain threshold in terms of sort of watt hours per kilogram for a battery to make aviation, electrified aviation, sort of workable. And he says that that's about 400. As you can see in the chart, you know, we're really playing with that now. And you know, whatever's in the research area right now, including some commitments from CATL for production by the end of the year, we're really talking about getting there. And that makes a lot of things possible. So there's a lot of other aspects to this, but essentially most of this circles around the battery, and a lot of the battery stuff circles around, there's a software component, as well as obviously the hardware component, material science component. So the interesting thing about these cost curves is that they essentially make things happen in kind of like a logarithmic way. So the learning curve for renewables, so I think this is referring to solar, is that the cost will come down 20% every time you double the amount produced. And so as you can imagine, as you keep doubling and doubling, the cost goes lower and lower. The incentive is to double it and double it more. Cost goes lower and lower, so it's a virtuous circle on itself. Then if you start to add in other things, and this kind of gets into the weeds a little bit, but you know, there's certain times that's more efficacious to charge. So time of use, integrations with the grid, you know, being paid for not pulling energy at particular times. All of this factors into how you would run transportation through electrification, through electricity. And then there's, of course, now some material science breakthroughs coming with conductivity. So that can really improve things tremendously. Theoretically, that can bring costs down, but that's still kind of in the hopeful category. And then just the straight efficiency of electricity over fossil fuels is huge, because at the moment, internal combustion is hovering something around 20% efficiency for, you know, fuel to movement. And whereas with electricity, it's usually 2 to 3 times that. So there's a whole bunch of beneficial tech that's coming really fast. And it definitely means that as batteries develop, as autonomy develops, as software develops, it changes the game. And we seem to be really at that inflection point. I think that the Tesla truck example that I mentioned earlier is a good example of that. I mean, these Tesla trucks are going up and over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they're able to cover hundreds of miles with fully load. So it's kind of already there. And then the question is, how do we get the infrastructure in place to support that kind of transition? So we can go to the next slide. And here we are. Sorry about the little hiccup at the bottom. So basically, there's a number of ways you can slice and dice infrastructure. I'll say from like a global, like, you know, bird's eye perspective, it's essentially you really need to get a lot of electrical conduit in the ground. How that shows up in terms of, you know, format, there are different types of charging, different levels of charging that have been demarcated, level 1, level 2, and level 3. If you go to a fast charger, you know, you're going to charge up your Tesla in 20 minutes. That's level 3. Level 2 would be probably something that might be installed in your garage if you have an electric vehicle. And then level 1 is coming right out of the wall. particularly coming out of the wall here in North America, where it's really very slow. And then you also have inductive charging. So inductive charging historically had been difficult to get in efficiency, high levels of efficiency, but recently in the last few years, there is much more efficiency in inductive. So if you're unfamiliar, inductive is when you're not actually plugging something in, but they're actually just hovering very near to each other. And so you can create an inductive receiver on a vehicle, an inductive charger down in the ground. I've worked with companies who have very high efficiency inductive charging. It is, of course, a little bit more expensive to add to a vehicle, but it also brings convenience. So specifically, one example is there's a transit agency up in California, and through the inductive charging, they were able to put these chargers at every bus stop or at a few bus stops along the route, wherever there was the opportunity to charge during the route. And so as a result, they were able to shrink the size of the battery pack on the buses, and that ended up saving them a ton of money. So it's kind of, there's a lot of trade-offs in this space, and that was a trade-off that they were willing to do. It also meant that they had a backup plan in case their depot charging went down. They had charging now throughout the locality. So it can be very positive as a tool, and I could imagine it being useful in something like drayage application, theoretically, where there is a lot of just sitting there waiting for a load. MCS stands for megawatt charging system. There are a number of these. There's also just very recently been standards around these. So it's not necessarily just the technology, it's also the standardization, and it's just happening. It's not, completely set. I think a good example of that is the North American Charging Standard through Tesla having just been adopted by all of these equipment manufacturers. So, you can see that the standards are still a little bit in flux. Certainly that's true with vehicle to grid. There's no standard yet, not really, and it's somewhat technologically challenging. But megawatt charging is great because it means that for big industrial applications like mining or ferries, ships, that kind of thing, they can opportunity charge with a lot of energy coming into their batteries. And just like with that transit agency, it means that they can keep operations moving because they keep topping up their charge. So it's a very different model than the model of liquid fuels, but in the same vein, it's sort of like, we need new models. Then there's depot charging. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. And then there's shore power, which is essentially like a ship where you basically need as much energy going into the ship as possible. They usually have 5, 6, 7 or more gigantic plugs that should plug into these ships, either to run them while they're at berth, or theoretically in the future to charge them when and if we get a significant amount of electrified shipping, which seems more and more possible as batteries get cheaper and with a higher density. So we can go to the next slide. Incentives. So like I said, this is the space that I've worked in. There are a number of tax credits, especially based on the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. In the state of California has a number of vouchers. So we have a lot of voucher programs. Those are interesting because sometimes they run out and they have to be refunded. So they go through these cycles. At least with the tax credit, you kind of, for the most part, know what you're getting, except that they keep changing which vehicles get which tax credit. So maybe not quite yet, but eventually that'll all be ironed out. Grants, I've worked with some major grant writing aspects here in California. There are some very big grants available for electrification of particularly ports and in areas where you have disadvantaged communities and they're getting a disproportionate amount of particulate in the air and therefore health issues. LCFS was something I was very, very focused on and have worked on for a while. And that's essentially like a transportation standalone cap and trade program. And essentially that means that if you use this much electricity, you get paid based on these carbon credits, in the same amount. And so though the price of the carbon credit fluctuates, you have at least guaranteed income, which we considered sort of like operational revenue. And so you're getting this consistent quarter by quarter operational revenue. And then, of course, at the local level, air districts and utilities can create their own incentives. Some of it is state mandated, and some of it is kind of stuff they just figure out, and that includes all the way down to power purchase level. So there's a lot of incentives out there. In California, it's like a huge mishmash of incentives. Around the world, I know it's sort of different layers as well. But yeah, it's a very active space. So next slide, please. Business models is the fun part, and I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to try to explain these as quickly and as effectively as I can. Essentially, charging as a service is kind of what it sounds like. It's instead of I'm a fleet owner, I'm going to figure out all of the environmental, engineering, and cost aspects of putting charging and into my depot. You're basically saying you do it. So you hire a company and you sign a contract that says you're willing to purchase energy at whatever rate, and it's going to require a certain amount of uptime, and that they're going to handle the maintenance. And that can be a very good deal for a lot of fleet operators, because their job is really to do, for the most part, logistics and to make sure that the fleet is available. But charging is kind of a whole new animal for them, because for them, though they've had to do fueling management, it's not quite like charging. Charging, you have situations where these level 3 chargers or MCS chargers or whatever or can go down, and then who's going to deal with it? So then you have to handle that. There are ways to do this through O&M contracts, but still, some people opt for charging as a service, where they're just paying for the energy over time and letting the charging as a service company deal with it. Likewise, with trucking as a service, there are trucking companies who do this, including autonomous trucking as a service, which is just starting up here in the US, where essentially, and like with fleet as a service, you basically say, I don't know what vehicles are the best for these routes. Tell me, we'll pay for the use of the vehicle as opposed to owning the vehicle, and why don't you own the vehicle as the service provider? So that can be very useful. And then likewise, microgrid as a service is something that I'm really passionate about, where if you have the need for high uptime, and maybe the utility is unwilling or unable to build out the level of power at the site that you need, you can develop a microgrid, which can have your own power generation on site, and it can also integrate with anything from on-site battery storage to making sure that you can either sell electricity back into the grid or only procure energy when it's the cheapest. So I love that option, because my belief is that the biggest challenge in this arena has to do with distribution. So not long distance transmission where you're going across states or up and down a large state, but distribution, which is like in a localized metro or in a small region. In the United States, we will need a lot more distribution compared to where we're at, and we don't really have a model for that. So in the moment, microgrid as a service, and microgrids in general, can sort of pick up the slack there. So why don't we go to the last slide? All right, so this is one partner of ours from some time back, and essentially this is depot charging, and it's also trucking as a service, and it's also charging as a service, and it's all of the above. Essentially, for that very, very strict drayage rule that I mentioned, you have the situation now where these fleets have to turn over very, very fast compared to their typical life cycle. And as I mentioned, these is a very low margin business, so they're not used to having lots of capital on hand to do, to pay for that high capex. And they don't have necessarily the longevity to wait around for that OPEX savings. So entities like this come in and they basically say, here, we're going to create a giant depot, and we're even going to buy and own the trucks, and you just get in them and do your job and pay us, monthly or however they have it worked out. And so it's a high level of disruption for the space because there are thousands and thousands of these truck operators, and they're usually independently owned here in California and through most of the United States. And so as a result, this is really flipping the space on its head, largely due to this the strictures of these regulations. So I think I will wrap it up there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. It was great. It was really interesting. And now I want to hand it over to Jean-Simon Venn, who is the CTO and the co-founder of Brainbox AI. He's going to talk about two current topics, AI and climate change, applied to lowering the carbon footprint of buildings. So Jean-Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Just want to make sure that you hear me and you see me without any problem, right? We're good?
It's all good. It's all good.
All
We
right.
see you and we
Thanks,
hear you.
Philippe. So you could start the presentation. You're going to be flipping the slide, right? Just want to make sure that you got the slide.
In a second, I'm just going to bring it up for you.
All right. Thanks. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Well, Philippe is loading up the deck. Want to give you a kind of state of the nation regarding where do we stand on the global warming, and at the same time, where do we stand with the AI revolution. And I really enjoyed the presentation of Jeff. Kind of give me the feeling that I would like to drive one of these trucks. And I want to basically also show you what can we do with AI to win that battle against the global warming, or at least stop it from getting worse. So let me know, Philippe, when you're ready.
Well, I have for some reason it doesn't show in my. I can't see it in the.
Do you want me to do the sharing?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Okay.
For some reason I can't find it, so.
Good. You're gonna have to let me know when you see it.
We see it now.
Okay, I'm going in full mode presentation, so.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So you good? You see it?
Yeah.
All right, so.
But you may want to look at doing a slideshow, because we see.
Do you see the slideshow now?
No.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We're good now. Thank you.
We're good. All right. Cool. Yeah. There's always a delay. So when you look at where we stand on the AI side on our planet, well, we're really going through the most important technology revolution humankind ever seen. It's actually it's have a bigger and a stronger impact than anything we went through, including steam machine invention. And it's because of that. When you look at that graph, is that asymptotic growth. So like every month, we're adding more power and more capacity to AI model, which allow them to do a lot more things than they were able to do a month ago. And that's why everybody is, on a certain sense, scared, and a certain sense, on a certain point of view, very excited by it, because we see everything that we could do with it. So it's really reaching a level which is unseen before, and the reason people are getting very scared is the fact that most of the recent AI model are now capable to do things which are surpassing the human performance. And let's be careful, like here, human performance is the average of the human on our planet. So of course, we're not all equal. So the average does not represent everybody. But it represents the average of what the human is capable of doing. So you saw that like it grow slowly, but then suddenly after 2015, it grew very, very rapidly. So we saw it coming regarding handwriting recognition, speech recognition. We saw the pace going. Sorry, there's a timer on the slide, so I'm gonna have to battle with these slides, and I forgot to remove the timer. But what really happened in the last 7 years is like the capability to do like reading comprehension and reading language understanding is really exploding now. And it's able to do the same thing we're doing, but it's doing it faster than we do. It will read a book very rapidly and understand that book in a few seconds, while we will take hours at least to read the same book. So that's why it's kind of surpassing the human performance. And I like this slide because it really shows what happened in the last 10 months. So we got GPT 3.5, which is ChatGPT. And this is how you see these first color here, not the big blue one, but the first color here. This is the performance of ChatGPT 3.5 on a several exam at university level. So it was already doing pretty good in a lot of different fields and very bad in others. But when ChatGPT 4 came in, it improved significantly the score of ChatGPT 3. And that is like within a few months, right, between each other. But what is interesting is it's very unequal. So if you're doing the bar exam, definitely GPT-4, especially the one in the US, is the way to go, right? It will get you to the 90% in a nanosecond. But look at what GPT 3.5 was. It was basically failing that exam. But when you get into other topic like calculus, surprising, eh? Calculus, you will not pass the minimum mark to graduate. And when you're in English literature, sorry, it's even worse. So at the same time that this is happening and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do with all that power, well, we're losing the battle with the CO2 emission. Even though like in several countries like Europe, United States, Canada, we're making significant effort to lower the footprint or at least stabilize it. There's a lot of other parts in the world where it's just exploding. So we're living on one planet. So if the total is, we're losing the battle on the total, we're losing all the battle. It's not a question of what country is doing what. It's the total which is important. And really what's happening is when we say, okay, well, why do I care about CO2? It's because of the energy in the atmosphere, which is growing. So we have more and more energy on our planet. And you see it into the temperature of the air, which is increasing. And we see that happening. And that's why you see all of the UN report talking about it. So 1.5 plus 1.5 is now inevitable. We're going to get it. Plus 2 degrees Celsius is now very, very likely. And plus 3 is now a possibility. So that's on the air side. And really what's happening, it's getting very dry. And we've seen it. This is a website that I like to track of the NASA and the U.S. Forest Department, where they basically track live all the fire in North America. So that was a snapshot taken in August. I'm just going to give you one stat on this. Like in Quebec alone, the number of acres that burned down this summer is 10 times the yearly average. So we're in a new game, right? And it was pretty much equal on the west side of our country here. And we're starting to see things that we never seen before. Like this is Greece, Rhode Island, at the beginning of the summer, and of course we all remember Maui. So this is happening, and it was not happening before, these type of event, and it's happening, and we're going to start to see that more and more because it's hotter and hotter out there. So the air is getting hot. The ocean is also increasing, and that's very, very scary because there's a lot more energy in the water than in the air. And when you have that huge mass of water, which is 2/3 of our planet, warming up, it's going to fuel all kind of weather pattern that we're going to get hit by. Sorry for the slide. The other thing that we're tracking a lot this summer is the Antarctic ice formation, which is not happening, as you could see here. So we're totally off. There's a lot. It's the winter down there. It's actually coming out of the winter. There's a lot less ice being formed during this winter on the Austral side than they usually are. And of course, you could see what that's going to happen. So a +3 degree will just accelerate all this. And we're modelizing here at BrainBox, what we're modelizing is what happens if it's +3. So at +3, the ocean will rise by 7 feet at high tide. So this is Boston if we reach +7 feet on the ocean. So you could see the different neighborhood. Logan Airport is gone. MIT is gone. And a good chunk of South Boston. And Boston will become basically an island in the downtown core. And you could go in every part of the world and modelize what happened. This is the Trans-Canada. Sorry for that timer, which is, I don't want to stop the presentation to remove it. So this is the in the Gulf, St. Laurent Gulf. It's near La Pocatière, Rivière-du-Loup. I'm highlighting this because this is a Trans-Canada highway. So the several sections of the Trans-Canada highway will just be gone. So you could imagine the impact on the economy of these regions, right? But the most impactful region in Canada is definitely the Vancouver area. The airport, Richmond, a good chunk of Surrey, that is all gone. And you could tell, like even in Miami, the south tip of Florida, if you own a condo down there, it's time to sell it because you're gonna have a huge appreciation when people will start to realize all this. So what is the AI role in this context, and how can you prevent this picture to become a reality? So we basically work on the control AI side of things, and I want to make the difference in between the generative AI and the control AI, which are two types of AI that are different goal, different purpose. Give you a couple of examples. This is the first autonomous ship we're managed by Control AI. So there's still a captain on board and it's still being operated by the human, but the AI is giving the optimal course of the ship based on tide, current, and fuel economy. So it could reach a destination in the optimized way. The picture you see here at the bottom, this is a Budweiser truck, and I was really enjoying the Jeff presentation. So we still have a driver to manage events which are not capable to be managed by the AI, but the AI is really optimizing the fuel and the routes to basically reach a destination in the most optimal way. And we all know Copilot in an airplane, they're reaching a level now which is really, really geared to optimization of fuel and picking the best route possible. But there's still a pilot in the plane. When you look at the AI world, well, as soon as you do a linear regression in high school, you're doing AI. So it's that big of a field. But the area which is quite interesting and it's been exploding over the last 10 years is the deep learning, because it's had the capability to learn and then use that learning to execute a different operation. And when you dive into the world of deep learning, it's been used in several different industries. There was just this summer a new antibiotic that was discovered thanks to deep learning that will really help us to have another tool set in the toolbox to fight the different infection that we're having, because we're getting to the end of the list of antibiotics on the medicine side. The area where we work a lot at BrainBox is the control AI. And so we want to optimize basically piece of assets. And in this world, it's really a lot of crunching. And I'll give this example of the autonomous AI in a regular car in California, which is basically, I'm sorry for the slide switch, which is basically like 48 neural network that are all together making 1 million distinct prediction for each decision step, which is a lot more than a human. As a human, we will do our circular check. We will try to drive responsibly, but at the end, we're winging a lot of things. And that's sometime where we get caught and we create an accident. So this is a different world where there's no such thing as winging things. So how do we use this in building? And I'm going to show you here how do we work with AI under the hood. where we basically connect to the control system that already exists in the building, and we extract all of that data and we mix it with other sorts of data like the weather, like the grid rate structure, like the sourcing of the electron, well, how this electron was manufactured at any given time that entered that building. And we're training a deep learning model that give us a prediction. And that prediction, once fully trained, is extremely, I really need to work on that timer here. It's really, really precise. And what we're looking for, we are really looking for, give me for the next 6 hours how the temperature or humidity will fluctuate in each of the zone of my building. And this is a retail store in the Montreal suburb region where we predict how the temperature will fluctuate in each of the zone of the store. And that prediction is the key to optimize. So, you know, it's interesting to know the future regarding how the temperature will fluctuate in a given room in a building. But what we're really looking for us is really like, okay, the temperature will increase until what hour, and then it will start to decrease. At what speed will it decrease? At what speed it will increase? And at what time it will change direction? So what do we do with that prediction? Well, once you have the prediction, we basically run all of the control permutation that you could possibly do. We get the prediction for each, and here you have a simplification of only 7 control strategy, and we validate on a multi-objective equation, okay, each of these control strategy, what am I going to do in a temperature in terms of comfort? What am I going to do in terms of a power and energy consumption? How much emission will I emit? And how I'm going to operate the equipment to make sure that I'm operating the equipment in a smoother possible fashion to prolong its lifespan. And I'm going to do that analysis for each of the control combination and figure out which one is the best one that I could do preemptively. So this is a simplification. Let me show you what it really looked like in real life. So this is a very small store with only 5 zones. We do that exercise for each zone, and all of the black line are all of the control option you have ahead of you. But there's only one, the yellow one, which is the optimal one to optimize all of the objective at the same time. And that is the one we're going to write back. So that is what the AI will basically decide to do in terms of control strategy. And that exercise will be done every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, and optimize the building. And what you're doing is you're basically pivoting from a reactive system, which is reacting to a situation to make a correction, to a preemptive system where you know something will happen, and I'm taking an advanced preemptive action to prevent that from happening to get a better future. And usually when you do that, you're saving energy. So is emission. We so far are deploying about 1,000 buildings in 17 countries, and what we see is that the AI is very efficient to save emission, up to 40%. Energy less, in between 15 and 25%, but it does improve the comfort at the same time, helping these areas where it's a bit too hot, a bit too cold, and people complain. But what's quite interesting, it does all of this at the same time operating the equipment in a smoother fashion. So stopping a lot of the stop-start that we usually see in equipment where every time you do a stop-start, we call that cycling, you basically degrade the lifespan of the equipment. And it's a bit like your brake on your car. So the much you're using, as much as you're doing pressing that brake pedal, you're going to eventually have to replace the brake. Well, if it's a pump, a ventilator, or other type of equipment, it's the same thing. You want to be operating as smoothly as possible. So let me just give you a very quick snapshot of that's what was happening at the building level. When you look at the grid level, the level of complexity just increased. And remember that the AI is extremely efficient compared to the human when there's a lot of calculation that need to be done very rapidly so you could use the output to make a decision. And that's exactly what AI is extremely good at. That's why you should never play chess with AI. And really, when you look at North America, we're still facing this kind of very awkward map where, depending where you are, the electron you're consuming is either very green or very dirty. And you need to factor that in when you're operating a portfolio of building, because really, if you want to save emission, you want to save money, it's one discussion. If you want to save emission, Well, we're not all equal. Depending where you are, you're going to have a lot of emissions saved or very little, depending where you are. So that should be part of your strategy if you really want to go and save the planet. At the same time, we're starting to see a lot now and a lot of green production capability being installed everywhere. The problem is the grid, and this is the latest version of the grid in the United States. And you see all of these coal power plants, which are the black one. And then you see the light blue, which are the natural gas power plant. The tan, it's even worse, it's the oil. And then you see all of the yellow, which are solar, and gray are wind. So a lot being installed, but the problem is like these purple line are the transmission line in between states. So depending where you are, you could probably not get that electron, which was fabricated or built by solar panel, to the right destination because there's just no capacity to reach it. So that as a when you're in a grid operator, you need to factor that in to figure out how can I optimize the grid power generation at any given time based on the demand and the transportation constraint that I'm facing. And so I'm pretty sure you see where I'm going with all this is what a great tool AI is to optimize that equation that you need to optimize in real time if you want to really have an impact, and do not start a coal power plant in the afternoon because you're running out of electron. So this new world of the grid where the power is now, generated in a distributed fashion. There's now storage capability being installed, which is giving you a way to optimize the demand based on when should you produce, where should you move the electron. The storage capacity is really giving you a hedge. But then again, it's just making the equation more complicated to optimize. And at that point, what we're doing at BrainBook is we're starting to work with the utility saying, okay, how can we get all the building together so they could form kind of a swarm of building, and how can we use AI to modulate the demand based on all your constraints so you will not start that coal power plant in the afternoon. And this is really where AI is gonna help us have a huge impact to optimize in real time that beautiful grid, which is now distributed and has capacity to storage, and make sure that we produce as green as possible and we lower the emission and a significant factor. So I'm going to stop here, Philippe, and I think you want to give some time for question, right?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you, all the speakers. Completely fascinating, interesting presentation. I learned a lot, again, at your contact, and I really want to thank you. The second thing I was going to say is that we have recorded, we are actually recording this event, and it will be online on our YouTube channel, the Rezoway YouTube channel, and we'll let you know all when that is done. And then I'm going to open it up for questions. You can type questions in the chat line. I'm going to start with a question to you all. I think the aviation transportation carbon footprint is about 3% of the total. I think this is a number I've seen. There is 1.5 billion cars on the streets all over the world. And I recently wrote a very general paper on the consumption that results from using this. iPhones, Facebook, all of this. It's about 4% and going up very rapidly. How do you think we can change the behavior of 8 billion people and make them, because you look at the US, for instance, the fact that man is or people are responsible for climate change is not a given. Okay, there's still some people who don't believe that. So why don't you share your thoughts about what it takes and how we do the behavioral change that is going to be required? Because what you've discussed is essentially optimizing and reducing the carbon footprint of industries. Now, how do we reduce the carbon footprint of people?
I think that we need a couple of weeks of webinars to deal with that. So maybe we can tackle low-hanging fruits. First, I think that we all have to realize that there's a disproportionate amount of emissions in some parts of the world. Typically, the 10% of the wealthiest people emit 50% of the world's emissions. So that's probably where we have to start first and have a look at their behaviors. We had our kids in the US and they were going to childcare, and everybody was saying that sharing is caring. So I think that first there will be some parts of re-equilibration that needs to happen between the different parts of the world. We can't deny access to a certain form of basic necessities to some parts of the world just because we are overusing the resources. So there's a part of sharing that needs to happen, and it needs first to happen on this side of the world. I would say on the wealthiest part. How do you change people's mind? I think that we have to show a desirable future and a desirable behavior in doing some of these steps. I think honestly, it's a very different thing than doing it for business. In general, for business, you're doing it because it's worth it. And I think that the discussion with businessmen that their business is pretty much doomed if they continue to use fossil fuels because they are getting exhausted, that they will get fines if they are greenwashing and pretending things that they are not in terms of impacting the environment. And if they're not doing the due diligence in understanding how exposed they are to risk, there's some things that they will get. About changing people's mind, it's all the matter also of themselves doing like businesses, their own assessments and understanding also what the biggest impacts are regions by regions. And understand that not everybody will be equal in terms of where they are, in what they consume, in how they impact. Someone who's flying extensively might consider that flying is becoming a problem. I think that the equivalent of understanding the business requirements for the businesses, that actually it's a necessity to transition. I think we have to use what we've been using recently for hacking and influencing people, right? Influencers have to build a future that is desirable, which is different than the one that we operate in. So if we want to change our approach to energy, to wastes in general, people can understand also that they have own benefits in doing that. In general, less meat means less emissions, and less meat means also less money spent in the supermarket. Last I checked, even organic vegetables are way, way, way cheaper than USDA prime beef. So you can really focus on the good things and make this desirable is probably the challenge when it comes down to influencing people. But I really do think it's a whole different ballgame than talking business.
Yes, it is. Anybody else has a thought or thoughts on this? I mean, I'm going to share one thing with you is that let's take flying, for instance. So you have folks who says, well, you need to stop flying, okay? And for a lot of people, it means, well, you need to stop going on vacation. Okay, they're going to equate the two. And that is not acceptable. I mean, that's a position that they will reject because they're not educated as much as you all are on the present and the future of climate change. And so the thing that I'm trying to get at is that there needs to be a way to present what climate change is and the solutions that do not create a reaction of a negative reaction in people. Because right now what I see is primarily that the general population react negatively to some of the things. I mean, if I was to tell people, well, you can't use Facebook more than 5 minutes a day, okay? Because there's 1.5 billion users of Facebook, and it consumes a whole bunch of energy. How would they react? I mean, I don't know if you have some thoughts on the topic.
This is Josh. I want to jump in here. I think maybe part of what we need to think about it's not so much changing the behavior of people, right? Like folks are still going to travel, they are still going to use Facebook, they're still going to drive their car, but what's really happening is behind the scene the technology is getting swapped out. So the power that powers the servers for Facebook, those are starting to get electrified. Like the grid is getting cleaner, the cars that we drive, we now have more electric vehicle options than I think we all imagined a few years ago. We have AI solutions coming to the table for building. So all that stuff is kind of happening behind the scenes. It's not really changing our functional use of those items. We can still use the buildings. It's just they might be smarter in terms of how they operate. We're still driving cars, but there's just a different, fuel source that's going into them. Yes, we could all walk more, ride our bikes. I think some of that is happening, but we're now at this inflection point where a lot of the technologies that have been worked on for the last couple of decades are scaling up in the market. They are cost competitive, and that is an absolute game changer right now.
Okay. Sounds interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I'll add one more thing, which is just based on polling data, it appears that people respond well to the idea of nature as opposed to climate. And so as a result of that, initiatives that have to do with greening or biodiversity or saving natural lands, some of these things have a little bit more of a guttural, tangible, emotional component to them that are a little bit easier for the majority of people to connect with, as opposed to sort of an abstract decarbonization regime. And so in that respect, some of the messaging can go there. I think people understand when they see fewer birds year on year that perhaps we could put out more, biodiversity targets, that kind of thing.
Okay. Anybody else has a thought or question for the audience? Doesn't seem like it. And if that is the case, then we will adjourn. And again, I want to thank you. It was really great. Thank you for the effort you put into this. And as soon as we have the YouTube channel on, we will share it, and so you can link to it. Just a question for the speakers. Do you want me to? I forgot to share your email addresses. I'm sorry. I mean, do you want me to share that on LinkedIn? Is that okay, or you don't want? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
I don't want you to get swamped with email addresses, with emails and stuff like this. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. And I'm not going to say we'll do it again, but thank you so much. And then we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.